At 9:30 a.m. on March 6, 1943, near Gafsa, Tunisia, General George S. Patton steps forward to inspect American troops and speaks in plain, direct terms about what is expected of them now. Men stand in tight ranks, many still carrying the memory of recent defeats and the frustration of realizing they had entered a war that did not forgive inexperience. Patton's arrival is not a ceremony. It is a correction. He has been sent into a broken rhythm, units shaken by hard lessons, officers cautious to a fault, and soldiers who had learned that German firepower and German discipline were not rumors. Just weeks earlier, the U.S. Army had suffered a major setback in Tunisia, most visibly at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. It had been a painful moment for the American public to absorb because it showed what veteran German formations could do to untested troops. German armored attacks broke through weak positions, command lines collapsed, and American units often fought bravely but without coordination. The losses were not catastrophic compared to later battles, but the psychological effect was serious. An army that believed it was ready had discovered it was still learning how to survive. Patton's job is not to comfort that army. His job is to force it into shape fast enough to stay alive for the next stage of the campaign. He clamps down on everything that can be measured: dress, weapons maintenance, guard discipline, marching order, and basic field routines. Helmets are strapped, salutes are enforced, and excuses are punished. Some men resent it. Others feel relief because it replaces uncertainty with standards. Patton understands a harsh truth about new armies in combat. When confusion spreads, losses multiply. Discipline is not decoration. It is insurance. In headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower watches these changes carefully. Eisenhower has to manage a coalition war under pressure, British and American forces, political expectations, and the urgent requirement to prove the Allies can fight Germany head-on. Eisenhower's command style is controlled and broad, focused on unity and logistics as much as battlefield decisions. He needs commanders who can generate results without tearing the alliance apart. Patton is aggressive, difficult, and sometimes reckless, but he can create forward motion, and forward motion is what the Allies need in Tunisia. Patton is not operating in a vacuum. The battlefield he inherits is shaped by supply lines, terrain, and the narrowing options for the Axis armies in North Africa. German and Italian forces are pinned between Allied pressure from the west and south and the British Eighth Army pushing from the east after victories in Libya. Tunisia has become the last holding area. It is also a trap. The Axis can still fight hard, but every mile costs fuel, vehicles, and men they cannot easily replace. On the German side, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel is already aware the situation is closing in. Rommel has spent months improvising under shortage, fighting delays, shortages of fuel, and orders from Berlin that often ignore conditions on the ground. By early 1943, he was exhausted and increasingly ill, but still dangerous in mind and experience. He understands the Americans are learning. He also understands the Allies are growing stronger each week because their logistics are improving and their combined strength is beginning to line up correctly. Rommel's challenge is strategic reality. The Axis can win battles and still lose the theater. Air power, shipping, and supply dominance belong to the Allies now. German units can still strike and break positions, but they cannot reset the map the way they once did. As Tunisia tightens, Rommel is forced to choose between attacking for advantage and conserving strength for survival. That is the same decision every German commander will face later in the war as the balance turns against them. Patton studies the same map from the Allied side and comes to a different conclusion. He believes hesitation is more costly than risk. He pushes his officers to move faster, to regain initiative, and to stop behaving as if the Germans are unstoppable. He understands that fear spreads through an army faster than bullets. One of his most effective tools is simply refusing to speak as if defeat is acceptable. This is also where Patton's methods create danger. He can demand speed and discipline, but he cannot remove the limits of training, experience, and exhaustion. Soldiers can be forced to march and fight harder, but they still break when the structure around them fails. Patton's strength is pressure, but pressure without control can turn into disorder. The Tunisian front begins to shift as Allied forces reorganize, Patrols become sharper, units dig in better, artillery fires are coordinated more effectively, small improvements appear everywhere, and together they change outcomes. The men on the line may not understand the full strategy, but they feel the difference. They start to believe they can meet German units and hold. If George S. Patton had not arrived when he did, would the American army have rebuilt itself fast enough to survive the next series of attacks and counterattacks in Tunisia? By March, the campaign is no longer about proving a point. It is about closing the trap before the Axis can stabilize. Eisenhower needs commanders who can act under pressure. Rommel needs time he no longer has. Patton needs results quickly enough to justify the faith placed in him. The battlefield is narrowing, and every day reduces the choices for both sides. The next week will show whether Patton's discipline creates momentum or whether momentum will cost more than his army can afford. American columns move before daylight, engines running low and crews already tired because delay in Tunisia means losing the ground you cannot easily take back. Patton drives his units forward with a clear priority: seize key terrain, hold it with discipline, and refuse to let German counterattacks dictate the schedule. The men under him do not experience this as a theory. They experience it as constant movement, short sleep, and orders that keep coming even when the roads are jammed with trucks and the dust sticks to every piece of equipment. The front is not a straight line. It is a collection of ridges, villages, and road junctions that control supply and artillery placement. Positions change hands because the side that arrives first can dig in, register guns, and force the opponent to pay for every approach. Patton's method is to strike, consolidate, and strike again. When his forces take one objective, the next order is not to admire it, but to keep pushing while the enemy is still reorganizing. In this stage of the Tunisian campaign, speed becomes a weapon by itself. Patton's rapid gains are not the result of one brilliant move. They come from a series of decisions made with a consistent mindset. Accept friction, accept confusion, and keep moving anyway. That approach works because the Axis is no longer operating from abundance. German units are short of fuel and replacement vehicles. Italian formations are often underpowered and stretched thin. Airfields and ports in Tunisia are under heavy pressure, and the flow of supplies cannot match demand. A German unit that retreats may not be able to return quickly. A position abandoned may stay abandoned because there is nothing left to reclaim it. In Allied headquarters, Eisenhower measures progress in practical terms. Success in Tunisia is not only tactical, it is political and strategic. A complete victory in North Africa will free Allied forces for the next invasion plans, prove the coalition can fight effectively, and remove the Axis from the southern Mediterranean. Eisenhower also understands that every day of delay allows the Germans to strengthen defenses in Europe. A slow campaign is still a campaign paid for in casualties. On the German side, Rommel watches the pattern forming. Allied pressure is not limited to one axis, it is layered and coordinated. British units push from the east, American and French forces press from the west and south, and air attacks disrupt movement whenever Axis columns attempt large shifts. Rommel's instinct is always to strike where the enemy is weak, but weakness is now harder to find. The Americans, in particular, are no longer standing still and waiting to be hit. They are beginning to hit back. Patton's men take several positions in rapid sequence, and the effect inside his army is as important as the ground itself. Soldiers who were recently hesitant now see Axis troops withdrawing under pressure. Officers who previously waited for perfect clarity begin acting on partial information because the pace demands it. These changes do not eliminate mistakes. They simply reduce paralysis, and in modern war, paralysis is often lethal. The danger in Patton's approach is the strain it places on every part of the system. Units move faster than maps can be updated. Supply trucks struggle to keep up. Artillery needs time to reposition and register fire. Radio nets become overloaded. When a commander demands speed, the army often pays for it in breakdowns, friendly fire risk, and exhaustion. Patton accepts those dangers because he believes the alternative is worse. An enemy given enough time will restore cohesion and punish hesitation with concentrated force. This is where Rommel's experience matters. He does not need to defeat Patton everywhere. He only needs to find one point where Patton's forward motion has outpaced his support. A sudden armored thrust, supported by anti-tank guns and artillery, can stop a rapid advance and turn momentum into retreat. Rommel understands that American courage is real, but American coordination can still be broken if pushed hard enough. The question is whether he has the fuel, the reserves, and the time to attempt it. For Patton, the campaign is also personal in a way he rarely admits outwardly. He wants to erase the stain of earlier setbacks and prove that American forces can fight as hard as any army in the world. That drive becomes contagious. Men will endure more hardship when they believe their leaders are committed and competent, but it also creates a risk of overreach because pride can distort judgment. In Tunisia, Patton's successes encourage the belief that the Germans are already collapsing. They are not collapsing yet. They are pulling back to positions where they can still kill in large numbers. What if Erwin Rommel had been given enough fuel and reserves to strike Patton's advancing forces at their weakest point during this week of rapid gains? Expert analysis of this phase is blunt. Patton's success comes from forcing tempo on an enemy whose logistics are failing, and that is one of the most decisive factors in operational warfare. But Rommel's defensive withdrawals are also skilled because he avoids encirclement and delays the Allies long enough to protect the larger Axis force from immediate destruction. Both commanders are operating under limits, and the man with fewer limits is winning. By the end of the week, Patton's reputation grows inside the Allied camp. The phrase spreading through staff rooms is simple: he keeps taking ground. But the German lines have not snapped completely, and the war in Tunisia is not finished. The enemy is still armed, still dangerous, and still capable of sudden violence. Patton's advance has bought the Allies time and initiative, but it has also drawn him closer to the zone where the Axis will fight hardest to avoid total defeat. Rommel studies the front through reports and maps that grow more bleak each day because Tunisia is turning into a confined battlefield where the Axis can no longer maneuver freely. His staff works the numbers: fuel remaining, trucks still running, artillery rounds available, and none of it matches what the situation demands. The German formations in North Africa still contain experienced troops, but they are now fighting under constant pressure from air attack, tightening Allied coordination, and supply lines that fail before the fighting even begins. Rommel's decisions in this period are shaped by two forces pulling against each other. One is the reality in front of him. Allied strength is increasing, and the Axis perimeter is shrinking. The other is the authority above him. Adolf Hitler expects resistance, expects willpower to substitute for supplies, and issues orders that often ignore geography and logistics. Rommel has spent much of the Desert War improvising, taking risks to keep his army alive and dangerous. But improvisation becomes harder when there is no room left to trade space for time. In early 1943, Rommel was not only under military strain, he is physically worn down. His health is deteriorating, and his fatigue is not the kind that a strong cup of coffee can fix. That matters, because modern command is not only issuing orders, it is a constant calculation under uncertainty. It is knowing which units are lying about their readiness and which units are capable of one more push. A commander who cannot rest begins to narrow his options without realizing it. His patience shortens, his willingness to gamble changes, his entire sense of time becomes compressed. Rommel watches how the Americans are operating under Patton and recognizes something that would have been unlikely months earlier. The U.S. Army is beginning to correct itself faster than expected. Early in the campaign, German commanders could often predict American reactions, slow to shift, hesitant to exploit an opening, vulnerable to concentrated attacks. Now the Americans are moving more aggressively and staying on the attack long enough to force withdrawals. This does not mean the Americans are flawless. It means they are learning in real time, and learning quickly in war is one of the most dangerous forms of strength. Rommel's operational situation is also shaped by the broader Axis command structure in Tunisia. German forces are not acting under one unified mindset. Some commanders want controlled withdrawal to preserve strength. Others want aggressive counterattacks to regain initiative. Italian units are often asked to hold key areas without the firepower to withstand modern combined arms attacks. The result is a defense that can fight fiercely in places, but struggles to move as a single system. Rommel understands that once an army loses coherence, it can still kill, but it cannot win. Patton is not the only Allied factor pressing in. Eisenhower's larger structure is slowly becoming effective. The Allies coordinate artillery, airstrikes, and ground movements with growing competence. The supply system feeding them improves. Roads and depots are expanded. Units that were once scattered begin concentrating for sustained pressure. In operational terms, the Allies are building depth. They can attack, absorb setbacks, and attack again without collapsing. For the Axis, each setback removes options they cannot replace. Rommel is forced into a command style that is less offensive than the one that built his legend. The desert campaigns had allowed long flanking movements and sudden armored punches. Tunisia offers fewer open spaces and more predictable channels of movement. Ridges and villages dominate the map, and each defensive position becomes a hold-fast point. This kind of fighting favors the side with superior artillery and air support. Rommel knows this. He also knows the Allies now have both. At this stage, Rommel's most valuable skill is judgment under loss. He has to decide where to fight hard and where to yield ground before it becomes a trap. Retreat is not cowardice in operational warfare. It is often the only way to preserve a fighting force. But retreat has political consequences, especially under Hitler's command. Rommel's frustration is not emotional theater. It is the reality of a commander who understands that obedience can destroy an army faster than the enemy. What if George S. Patton had slowed his advance long enough for Rommel to stabilize a defensive line and restore Axis coordination in Tunisia? This phase reveals a critical truth that historians emphasize when analyzing campaigns. Momentum is not only created by aggression, but also by enemy weakness. Patton is pressing forward because he senses the Axis cannot sustain continuous defense. Rommel is withdrawing and striking when possible because he senses he cannot afford full-scale battles that consume resources he cannot replace. Both men are making rational decisions. The difference is that one is operating inside a growing system, and the other is trapped inside a collapsing one. Rommel's final calculations in Tunisia are about survival and delay. He tries to create enough friction to slow the Allied timetable because time is the only resource he still has. He shifts units, prioritizes key terrain, and looks for moments when Allied coordination can be disrupted. But the pressure does not stop. Each day the ring tightens, and each week brings fewer ways out. By the time Rommel prepares to leave North Africa, his mind is still working, still dangerous, but his battlefield is no longer one he can shape. The Americans are no longer just present. They are advancing with purpose. And the Axis, for all its discipline and experience, is running out of space to fight. Rommel's staff works under strain because every hour forces another decision about what can be held and what must be abandoned. German officers relay reports of Allied movement, shifting artillery, and increasing air activity. Patton's name appears more often in those reports now, not as a rumor, but as a pattern of behavior, rapid occupation of positions, relentless pressure, and a refusal to pause long enough for the Axis to regain balance. Rommel does not treat this as a mystery. He treats it as a military problem that can be analyzed. Rommel's assessment of Patton is blunt and professional. Patton's strength is operational tempo. He pushes hard and accepts risk, which makes him difficult to predict. But the same quality creates vulnerability. An army moving quickly can outpace its own logistics, lose coordination, and become exposed to sudden counterattacks. Rommel understands the kind of war Patton is trying to fight, a war where initiative is everything. Rommel has fought the same way himself. That is why he knows it can be broken if the enemy finds the right moment. Patton's headquarters operates under constant pressure to keep the advance moving. Orders come fast, fuel consumption rises, vehicles break down. The infantry does not always have enough rest to prepare properly, yet Patton's system keeps gaining ground, partly because he forces hard standards and partly because the larger Allied machine is improving behind him. Eisenhower's command structure is making sure Patton has what he needs: replacements, supply routes, and coordination with other Allied forces. In operational warfare, a commander's boldness matters, but it only succeeds when supported by a functioning rear area. The Allies are finally building that in North Africa. The battlefield itself is becoming compressed. Tunisia is the last stretch of land under Axis control on the continent. This compression changes everything. It forces German and Italian units into tighter positions, increases the density of artillery and anti-tank defenses, and makes movement easier to detect and strike from the air. For the Axis, every withdrawal reduces options. For the Allies, every captured position is another step toward sealing the exits. In this environment, small mistakes become costly. A misread road, a delayed resupply convoy, or a poorly coordinated attack can bring heavy casualties in minutes. Patton's approach creates victories, but it also creates friction. The more aggressively he moves, the more he risks miscommunication with adjacent units, especially in a coalition war where multiple commands and national forces share limited space. One operational mistake the Allies remain vulnerable to in Tunisia is fragmentation, units advancing at different speeds, losing support from artillery or armor, and exposing themselves to counterstrike. Patton believes speed will prevent that. Rommel believes speed can cause it. As Tunisia nears collapse, Rommel's role shifts from seeking decisive battle to delaying the inevitable. The Axis in North Africa is not just fighting on the front line, it is fighting the clock. Airfields are threatened, ports are hit repeatedly, supplies arrive in smaller quantities and often at great cost. Even the best tactical planning collapses if trucks have no fuel or if units have no ammunition. Rommel's skill is still sharp, but he is no longer in a war where skill alone can reverse the situation. Patton, in contrast, is operating in a war where success reinforces itself. Each gain boosts morale, strengthens Allied confidence, and convinces commanders that continued pressure will break the Axis. That is mostly correct, but it can also create dangerous assumptions. Patton's greatest misunderstanding in this phase is believing the enemy is already finished. Axis troops are trapped, but they are still capable of hard defense and sudden attacks. A trapped enemy often fights with extreme determination because retreat is no longer an option. Eisenhower balances this reality by insisting on coordination and preventing Allied commanders from turning the campaign into personal contests. He understands that victory is not earned by one general's reputation, but by the combined effect of logistics, air power, and sustained ground pressure. Patton's personality makes him seem like a singular force, but he is operating within a larger system that is finally working. Rommel's reputation makes him seem unstoppable, but he is operating inside a system that is failing around him. What if Erwin Rommel had been able to choose the battlefield and timing for one final concentrated counterattack against Patton's forward-moving forces in Tunisia? Expert analysis of the end of the Tunisian campaign comes down to a few core realities. The Axis misjudged its ability to hold North Africa once Allied air and naval dominance tightened supply. The Germans overestimated what discipline and bravery could accomplish without fuel, replacements, and freedom of maneuver. The Allies, on the other hand, underestimated early how quickly inexperienced units could break under coordinated armor and artillery, but corrected that mistake with rapid reforms. Patton's strict discipline accelerated that learning curve. Rommel's controlled withdrawals prevented immediate disaster, but could not change the strategic outcome. As the Axis position contracts further, the war becomes less about sweeping desert maneuvers and more about pushing an exhausted enemy into a corner. Patton's forces continue to move, and German units continue to resist, but the direction of the campaign no longer changes. The collapse is not sudden, it is the steady removal of options, day after day, position after position. By the end of this phase, Patton's confidence is real, but it is earned at a cost measured in fatigue and casualties. Rommel's judgment remains dangerous, but it is trapped inside a shrinking perimeter he can no longer expand. Tunisia is closing, and the men who fight there can feel it. The campaign is about to reach its final outcome, and neither commander can stop what is coming. Axis units fall back into smaller pockets, surrounded by Allied artillery, cut off from reliable supply, and increasingly exposed to airstrikes that punish movement in daylight. German and Italian soldiers hold positions as long as ammunition and food last, then withdraw again because the geography of Tunisia no longer offers escape routes that matter. For men on the ground, the strategic picture is simple even if the politics are not. The exits are closing, and the Allies now have the resources to keep closing them. American units continue advancing with a different mood than they carried weeks earlier. The confidence is not built on speeches. It is built on experience, learning how to keep weapons functioning after days without maintenance time, learning how to move under fire without losing formation, learning how to call for artillery support and stay alive long enough for it to arrive. Patton's harsh discipline has hardened routines that had once been treated casually. Soldiers no longer assume they will be forgiven for being unready. They assume they will be punished by the enemy first. For Eisenhower, Tunisia is becoming the proof that the Allied coalition can win a major campaign. It means more than one battlefield. Victory in North Africa opens the way to operations against Sicily and Italy, and it tightens Allied control of the Mediterranean. It also sends a message to Germany. The United States is not a temporary presence. It is building an army that will grow stronger with every month of fighting. Inside the Axis command, the end is managed as a controlled collapse. Field reports become less about seizing initiative and more about delaying surrender long enough to evacuate what can be saved. The airfields and ports that once sustained Rommel's campaigns are now overwhelmed. Supply ships do not arrive in enough numbers, and many are intercepted or destroyed. Even when supplies make landfall, they often cannot reach the units that need them. The war has become logistical as much as tactical, and in that kind of war, the losing side can fight bravely and still be doomed. Rommel is no longer in Tunisia when the final surrender arrives. He departs North Africa in March 1943, physically exhausted and increasingly ill, and his role in the campaign ends before the last act is complete. His departure does not change the outcome, it reflects it. Tunisia has become a theater where German skill cannot overcome Allied material strength and operational coordination. Rommel leaves with his reputation still powerful, but his options shrinking. The kind of offensive war that built his name is ending, replaced by defensive assignments where retreat becomes the standard condition. Patton does not experience the end of Tunisia as closure. He experiences it as validation and preparation. He has proven he can take a damaged force and drive it forward under pressure. He has also proven he can demand an extreme pace and still keep units functioning. These strengths will later make him one of the most effective American field commanders in Europe. But the North African campaign also exposes the cost of that style. Exhaustion, mistakes made at speed, and friction with other commanders who prefer caution and method. The final Axis surrender in Tunisia came in May 1943, with roughly 250,000 German and Italian troops captured. The number is immense, and it matters operationally because it removes experienced formations from the war and strips Germany of its foothold in North Africa. For the men who surrender, the emotion is not dramatic. It is often a quiet recognition that fighting without supply and without maneuver is no longer war in any meaningful sense. It is only dying in place. Expert analysis of Tunisia highlights three decisive conclusions. First, Allied victory becomes inevitable once air and naval dominance choke the Axis supply chain. Second, the U.S. Army's rapid improvement is driven by harsh experience combined with leadership that forces structural correction, not gradual adjustment. Third, Axis tactical competence does not collapse in Tunisia. It is outpaced and outsupplied, and that is a different kind of defeat, one that skill alone cannot fix. For American audiences, Tunisia is often remembered as the place where the U.S. Army stopped being new. The campaign begins with painful lessons and ends with an enemy surrender on a massive scale. It shows how quickly a modern army can evolve under pressure, and how costly that evolution is for the men forced to learn in real combat conditions. Patton leaves North Africa with a reputation for momentum and strict control. Eisenhower leaves with a stronger coalition and a clearer path into Europe. Rommel leaves with the understanding that the Axis is entering a stage of war where brilliance is no longer enough. Tunisia is not the most famous campaign of the Second World War, but it is one of the most decisive turning points for the men who fought there, because it marks the moment when the balance of power begins to move steadily in one direction. The war continues, but the lesson of Tunisia stays the same. When momentum replaces certainty, the side that learns faster and sustains supply will force the other side into the final, irreversible retreat.